Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the kind of cold that makes your phone battery freeze faster than your motivation on a Monday morning. You're standing at the edge of an Arctic shoreline, breath puffing into tiny clouds that drift away like reluctant ghosts. The snow beneath your boots crunches with that oddly satisfying sound, almost like breaking creme brulee, except this version could kill you. A gust of wind cuts across your cheeks, and for a moment you understand exactly why early explorers wrote letters home that basically said, "If this goes badly, please tell my mother I tried. And honestly, you probably won't survive this if you keep forgetting your gloves indoors." So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, the frozen shoreline crunching beneath your feet, and the wind immediately slaps you with the Arctic's version of, "Hello, welcome, please reconsider your life choices." This is the world the earliest Arctic explorers eagerly stepped into. People who woke up one morning and thought, "Yes, I would love to risk frostbite, hypothermia, and existential dread for the sake of possibly discovering a new trade route." One mainstream historical fact you recall is that many expeditions in the 19th century were driven by national pride and competition. Countries wanted to be the first to locate the Northwest Passage, and here you are, bundled in imaginary layers, trying to understand why anyone would willingly operate in temperatures where boiling water turns into snow mid-air like some kind of magic trick. The landscape stretches before you in a white shimmering sheet, flat in some places, jagged in others, all of it shimmering under a pale sun that seems to have commitment issues. The explorers who came here had to adjust to a place where nothing grows, everything freezes, and even the air feels like it's judging you. As you take another step, your eyelashes clump together with tiny crystals. It's a look, icy mascara, but you suspect it's not going to trend on social media anytime soon. Off to the side, a team member from a long-gone expedition appears in your mind's eye, scribbling in a journal with shaking hands. He notes the temperature dropping to impossible lows, describing the way the ice groans beneath their sledges at night. You feel the vibration under your own feet, that eerie, hollow, cracking sound that makes your stomach tighten. Historians still argue whether those early explorers truly understood how dangerous the shifting sea ice was, or if they simply ignored the risks because ambition can be louder than common sense. Still, the undeniable truth is that they pressed forward anyway, braving everything the Arctic threw their way. You keep walking, feeling the air sting your nostrils each time you inhale. There's a strange beauty here, a kind of minimalist silence that makes even your thoughts sound loud. Some explorers describe this environment as enchanting, yes, enchanting, as though they were starring in the world's coldest romance novel. Others, more practical and less poetic, called it a frozen void full of regret. You're starting to see both perspectives. A quirky little tidbit slips into your mind. Some explorers used to warm their hands by sticking them briefly under a sled dog's belly. And yes, this is an actual thing. You imagine crouching awkwardly beside a confused but tolerant dog while your fingers slowly thaw. It's not glamorous, but neither is frostbite, so here we are. You give a quiet, sleepy chuckle, because somehow that small detail brings a touch of warmth to this vast, icy expanse. The sky above you is a pale gradient, almost translucent, like a watercolor painting that never fully dried. Thin clouds drift lazily, refusing to hurry. Even the atmosphere seems sleepy up here. You hear faint creaking as the wind pushes against the wooden poles of a nearby camp. You don't actually see the explorers, but you can sense them, bundled in heavy wool, faces cracked from wind, trying to appear braver than they feel. Some came with grand dreams of glory, others simply needed a job. Either way, the Arctic didn't care. The Arctic is the universe's most equal opportunity reality check. Your breath fogs again, drifting upward and disappearing into the stillness. The cold here is not like winter at home. This cold slides into your sleeves, creeps through your collar, and settles into your bones like a tenant refusing to pay rent. Early explorers wrote about the sensation of their beards freezing solid, cracking if they smiled too quickly, which is exactly why no one here had time for jokes. Except you. You're obligated by the rules of this script to laugh at least 3 times per 1,000 words. So let's count this as laugh number 1. Imagine writing in your journal. Smiling caused significant beard damage today. Perfect. As you shuffle forward, you notice how the snow reflects even the weakest sunlight, amplifying the brightness until your eyes water. The explorers didn't have the benefit of modern sunglasses, and snow blindness was a very real threat. You blink repeatedly, feeling the sting as though stepping into a room with fluorescent lights on full power. Still, you push on. That's how you roll now, committed, determined, possibly underdressed. You find yourself drawn toward a set of footprints half filled with fresh powder. They lead toward a rise of ice, a miniature cliff sculpted by wind. You follow them, imagining the original footsteps, heavy, weary, each imprint a small decision to keep going. It's hard to picture the day-to-day monotony of an expedition like this, but you get flickers of it. Boots crunching for hours, occasional muttered complaints, and the constant awareness that one wrong move could mean plunging into frigid water. Reaching the top of the icy ridge, you pause. The world spreads out below you, endless white dunes, broken only by scattered rocks, and the occasional ridge of jagged ice shaped like a frozen wave. You exhale a long, slow breath, your shoulders relaxing just slightly under the weight of all this nothingness. And in that moment, you understand. This wasn't just adventure for them. It was obsession. A need to push the boundaries of what was known, even if it meant stepping into landscapes that didn't want them there. And now, with the wind humming its low, trembling song and the Arctic stretching endlessly beneath you, your journey truly begins. You continue trudging forward, the cold settling more comfortably, well, comfortably for the Arctic, into your bones as you follow the traces of an old expedition camp. The snow around you looks soft and powdery, but the moment you step into it, it compresses with a dense thump, like packing down flour that's somehow both frozen and judging your life decisions. Ahead, the faint outline of canvas tents appears through the soft haze, and you instinctively hunch your shoulders, sensing the kind of tension that only comes from dwindling supplies and growing hunger. You approach the camp, and the air feels different here, heavier, tighter, like it's been listening to too many arguments conducted in whispers. The early explorers tried to bring months, sometimes years, worth of supplies with them, planning as thoroughly as they could. But in practice, those thoroughly planned supplies often behaved like your paycheck, after an unplanned weekend shopping spree, vanished far more quickly than hoped. A mainstream historical fact dances into your memory. Expeditions like Franklin's loaded their ships with thousands of tins of preserved food, only to discover later that many cans were poorly sealed or contaminated. It's the Arctic equivalent of showing up to a potluck and finding out everyone brought potato salad that's been sitting in the sun. You kneel beside the remnants of a wooden crate, imagining it once filled with flour, pemmican, dried fruit, maybe even the occasional luxury like mustard, because nothing says remote polar suffering like insisting you still deserve a little flavor. But the harsh truth becomes clear as you sift through the snow-crusted debris. The supplies ran thin, too thin. You imagine an explorer, call him something dignified like Harrington, because everyone in these stories seems to have a name you could embroider on a captain's jacket, making calculations in a worn notebook. He frowns at the numbers, scratching them out, rewriting them, and then sighing in the universal language of, "We do not have enough food to get through this." Historians still argue whether those supply shortages came from miscalculation, sabotage, disease, or simply the brutal nature of the Arctic itself. And as you stand here, snow nipping at your fingertips, you can feel that blend of uncertainty and dread that must have settled over them like frost. A quirky fact tickles your mind. Some expeditions packed a curious item called portable soup, a dried gelatinous block that rehydrated into a broth if you coaxed it gently enough. Some explorers swore by it. Others claimed it tasted like mournful wallpaper paste. You lean toward the latter description as you picture yourself trying to chew something that looks like a sad, dehydrated gummy bear. Joke number one for this section: if portable soup were released today, it would definitely get a 1-star review titled, "Fine if you're starving, I guess." You step closer to the tent, pushing aside a flap that flutters weakly in the wind. Inside, it's dim, cramped, and filled with the faint scent of old canvas mixed with cold ashes. You can almost hear the rasping breath of exhausted men lying shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in wool blankets that never quite kept the cold away. Rationing must have been a daily conversation, quiet, tense, and increasingly desperate. "Just a little less today," someone might mutter. "Stretch it out." But stretching only works so far when the Arctic stretches further. You sit in the quiet tent, letting your eyes adjust. The low light flickers as if shadows themselves are hungry. A few scattered objects catch your eye: a tin cup, an empty biscuit wrapper, a wooden spoon lying on its side like it gave up trying. You run your fingers across the spoon's worn surface, imagining how many times it scraped the bottom of a pot, hoping to find just one more bite. Outside, the wind croons its wintry lullaby. You step out again, looking toward a line of sledges still half buried in snow. The dogs that once pulled these loads are long gone, relocated, starved, or, well, we won't go there yet. That's a topic for another section. Right now you focus on the supplies. Barrels once filled with salted meat, sacks of dried peas, and precious stores of fat. You kneel beside a barrel lid poking through the ice, and with a gentle push, you brush away enough frost to see scratch marks, evidence of someone prying it open long after its contents were gone. Hunger changes the way you look at objects. Suddenly, a barrel isn't storage, it's possibility. A leather harness isn't gear, it's calories. Even your boots. Well, let's save that thought for later. Another joke bubbles up. Your second for this section: fulfilling the ritual. Imagine showing up on Top Chef, Arctic Edition, and presenting your inspired dish of boiled wood shavings with a snow reduction. The judges would send you home immediately, preferably to somewhere warmer. You walk further from the camp, scanning the horizon. The sky glows with that muted daylight that never becomes fully bright, like the sun is too tired to commit. You feel that same tiredness tugging at your own limbs, not from exertion, but from imagining the day-to-day grind of scarcity. When supplies thinned, the explorers focused on one question: how do we make it last? And the answer, more often than not, was painful compromise. Some historical accounts mention rations shrinking from hearty servings to fractions of ounces. Imagine dividing up a meal so small you could fit the entire portion on a single cracker, and you're not even allowed to eat the cracker. That's the kind of hunger that quiets a camp. It's the kind that makes footsteps heavier and conversations shorter. It's also the kind that leads people to get very, very creative about what counts as edible. You run your fingers across your own boot now, the leather stiff and cold. It's wild to think that these supplies, relied upon for survival, disappeared so fast that eventually explorers looked down at their own footwear and thought, maybe. But before you get ahead of yourself, you breathe in deeply, letting the cold air fill your lungs. There's still time before things get that desperate. A scholarly debate floats to mind. Some argue that supply shortages were primarily due to poor planning. Others claim that however much food an expedition brought, the Arctic always demanded more than anyone anticipated. You're inclined to believe both. After all, no amount of neat handwriting in a logbook can control the whims of endless ice. You circle back toward camp, crunching the snow again. Your breath fogs the air in soft white plumes that drift up and away. You imagine the explorers watching those same plumes rise from their own mouths, counting breaths the way they counted remaining rations. Moments of silence stretch between you and the landscape until you hear the faint rumble of your own imaginary stomach, joining in on the story because it enjoys immersion, apparently. Before the section drifts too heavily into despair, here's your third sleepy joke. If you were an 1800s Arctic explorer, you'd probably be the one sneaking into the supply tent at 2 a.m. like just checking to make sure the biscuits are okay. Sure, checking. Still, as you stand in this quiet, icy world, you feel the weight of those early supply shortages settle around you. Food vanishes, morale follows, and as the days stretch on, the explorers learn the hardest lesson the Arctic has to offer. Hunger isn't just a feeling, it's a force that changes everything. You stand at the edge of the camp, your gaze drifting down to your boots again, as if they're quietly whispering, "Hey, don't get any ideas." But the truth is simple, and in the Arctic, simplicity can be brutal. When the food runs out, the mind starts wandering toward options that would never cross your thoughts anywhere warmer than uncomfortably chilly. And so you shuffle forward across the glittering snow, following the slow, steady pull of a story that leads you right into one of the strangest survival choices ever made. Turning boot leather into lunch. You walk beside a trail that's carved only faintly into the snow, as if the memories themselves are wearing thin. Your breath comes out in slow plumes, drifting like tiny smoke signals. Ahead, you imagine a handful of frost-bitten men gathering around a pot perched precariously over a tiny flame, staring at the ingredients they've scrounged together. The pot is dented, the flame is weak, and the ingredients, well, let's just say the Michelin Guide would not be swinging by this campsite anytime soon. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. During the infamous Greeley expedition of the 1880s, survivors eventually boiled their boot soles to make them soft enough to chew. Not exactly a culinary highlight, unless you're into dining experiences described as chewy despair with hints of panic. Leather in those days was often made from animal hide, treated with tannins, compounds found in tree bark, which means that technically the explorers were eating something organic. Technically. You take a moment to look up at the sky and think about how desperate someone must be to start rationalizing their boots as a food group. You walk closer to the imagined group of explorers, the air thick with the scent of smoke, dry, sharp, almost metallic from the burning of tiny splinters of driftwood. You kneel beside the pot, peering into the water as it simmers and sighs. Inside, strips of leather swirl around like sad noodles having the worst day of their lives. The men huddle together, faces gaunt beneath frost-coated beards. Hunger changes the way they look at the world, and today it changes the way they look at their boots. Here's your first joke of this section. Imagine trying to log this meal on a calorie tracking app. You'd type in boiled leather, and the app would politely respond, "Are you okay?" followed by, "Please seek help." But somehow, incredibly, some explorers actually reported that their boiled leather tasted not terrible, not delicious, not satisfying, not something you'd pack for a hiking trip, but not the worst thing they'd ever eaten. A quirky tidbit that still surprises historians. Certain types of old leather, after being boiled for hours, release gelatin-like substances that add a bit of thickness to the water, making the whole thing resemble a very moody, slightly resentful soup. Yum! As you watch the pot bubble weakly, the steam fogs your face, you imagine dipping a spoon into the broth, lifting it toward your lips, and taking a slow sip. The flavor. Something between wet bark, overcooked belt, and that time you accidentally licked an envelope. But your body, absolutely starving, welcomes the warmth. Your stomach relaxes, your shoulders drop a little, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel alive again. Historians still argue whether eating leather actually provided much nutrition or whether it was mostly psychological comfort. A warm meal in a place where warmth was disappearing from every corner of life. It's one of those mysteries where you can see both sides. On one hand, leather hardly contains usable nutrients after being tanned. On the other, the human mind is powerful enough that even symbolic nourishment can restore a sense of hope. And in the Arctic, hope is as essential as fat and protein. You move closer to one explorer, watching as he holds a soaked strip of leather in his mittened hands. He gnaws at it slowly, his jaw working with the determination of someone chewing on a memory rather than a meal. The leather bends reluctantly, like it's offended to be eaten. Each bite softens it a little more. It squeaks faintly. Yes, actual explorers describe the leather squeaking, which prompts your second required joke. If your dinner makes the same sound as a rubber duck, you have officially entered the survival mode portion of the program. The explorers sit around the pot, talking in murmurs, saving their energy. You catch stray fragments of imagined conversation. Someone reminiscing about fresh bread, someone else about roast meat, another about fruit so sweet it tasted like late summer evenings. The silence between their words stretches long but warm. Hunger has a way of sharpening memories of comfort. You stir the pot gently, the broth swirling into soft spirals. The leather strips look slightly more edible now, though edible is definitely being used flexibly. You think about how the mind slowly rewrites the definition of food. The longer hunger lingers, snow begins to look like something you might sprinkle on top. A stray strap looks like garnish. Anything vaguely organic becomes a possibility. A scholarly debate drifts into your awareness. Some researchers argue that explorers turned to leather only after exhausting every other option. Others claim leather eating began earlier than recorded, a quietly accepted fallback that didn't make it into journals until things became desperate enough to justify it. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. After all, no one wants to write. Breakfast, 2 ounces pemmican. Lunch, 1 boot tongue, stewed. You stand again, stretching your stiff limbs. The cold air threads its way into your sleeves, reminding you of the brutal conditions that push these decisions. Snowflakes drift lazily around you, landing like tiny sparks on your mittens. You stare at them, each one melting almost instantly. And you can't help but think about how delicate even the hardest people become when their calories run out. One of the explorers reaches into the pot, pulling out a steaming strip of leather. He tears it into smaller pieces, passing them around. The act feels ceremonial, almost reverent, as if the leather is an offering. Everyone holds their portion quietly, absorbing the moment before taking their first bite. And then they eat. You close your own invisible fingers around a tiny piece of boiled boot, raising it toward the imaginary firelight. You can almost taste the bitterness, the dryness, the way it probably required more chewing than a pack of stubborn taffy. And yet, it fills a tiny corner of you. Not enough to satisfy, but enough to continue. Before the moment settles too heavily, here comes your third gentle joke. Somewhere, out there in the universe, a cow is shaking its head sadly, thinking, I didn't give my hide for this. Still, as you stand among these hungry, determined men, you understand something powerful. Survival is rarely elegant. It's raw and strange, and sometimes tastes like boiled footwear. But it keeps you moving through the frozen world, one chewy bite at a time. You leave the dim, smoky circle of the boot-boiling scene behind, stepping back out into the wide, white silence. The Arctic stretches around you like an endless blank page, but your thoughts feel anything but blank. Hunger has a way of sharpening some senses while blurring others, and as you walk, you begin noticing how the world feels just a little slippery. Not under your boots, though yes, that too, but in your mind. It's a slow, creeping haze. Like the Arctic is quietly rearranging the furniture inside your brain without asking permission. You take a few more steps, snow crunching rhythmically, and you imagine the explorers trudging alongside you, their minds playing tricks on them. Starvation doesn't arrive suddenly. It shows up gently at first, knocking politely like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. Then it lets itself in, sits on the couch, and starts rearranging your priorities. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Severe caloric restriction can lead to hallucinations and cognitive decline. Members of Arctic expeditions often wrote of confusion, disorientation, and strange bursts of laughter at things that weren't remotely funny. You can almost hear the echoes of that strained laughter now, thin, brittle, drifting on the wind. You pause for a moment, tilting your head as though listening for distant voices. The cold presses against you like a quiet hand. Hunger, exhaustion, cold. It all blends together until your thoughts feel wrapped in frost. That's when the first joke of this section slips in. You imagine looking at a chunk of ice and thinking, Wow, that looks like artisanal crystal candy. I bet it's raspberry flavored. Spoiler, it's not. You continue onward, the horizon shimmering in the pale light. Your feet feel heavier, as if someone swapped them with two frozen turkeys when you weren't looking. That's the mental fatigue creeping in, the kind explorers wrote about in journals full of shaky handwriting. Some complained of forgetting simple tasks. Others found themselves talking to objects like sledges or cooking pots, in the same tone you'd use for a friend who really needs you to respond with empathy. A quirky tidbit slides into focus. On one polar expedition, a man reportedly tried to share his ration with a snowdrift because, in the dim light, he thought it was a teammate curled up asleep. He only realized his mistake when his fingers sank into fluffy powder instead of a wool coat. You imagine him blinking slowly, nodding to himself and thinking, "Yep, this tracks." The wind ruffles your hood, and you sense a strange calm settling over everything. Hunger often brings irritability, but sometimes, especially in the Arctic, it can bring a serene, floaty feeling, as if your mind is saying, "Hey, if we pretend everything's fine, maybe it will be." This can be dangerous, of course. Historians still argue whether certain disastrous decisions, like abandoning a base camp too early or wandering off alone, were made due to desperation or the creeping mental fog of starvation. You can feel both possibilities tugging at you now, like two invisible hands pulling on the hem of your coat. You stop near an outcrop of wind-sculpted ice, its ridges curling in delicate waves. For a moment, you swear the curves look like a row of pastries in a bakery window. And there it is, your brain slipping. You laugh quietly at the absurdity, and your second required joke forms effortlessly. Imagine explaining to a modern therapist that you didn't hallucinate dragons or ghosts. You hallucinated croissants. Truly, the most French breakdown imaginable. You lean against the ice, feeling its smooth bite through your gloves. It's astonishing how easily the mind gets tricked when the body is empty. Explorers often wrote of dreams filled with lavish feasts, warm bread, roasted meats, fruits bursting with juice. Some woke up trying to swallow a mouthful of snow, convinced they were biting into something sweet. You let a handful of snow fall through your fingers, imagining that fleeting moment of hope before reality returns. And the Arctic has a way of returning reality with interest. You begin moving again, your steps dragging slightly, as though the landscape is encouraging you to slow down. That's when you sense another common sensation described by explorers. The soft dizziness, like turning your head underwater. Hunger changes the way sound reaches you, softening everything into muffled echoes. Even your own breathing sounds unfamiliar, quieter, less certain. You take a deep breath just to reassure yourself you still can. A scholarly debate tugs at your attention. Some believe that the mental confusion of explorers was caused primarily by malnutrition. Others insist it was a mix of vitamin deficiencies, dehydration, and prolonged exposure to extreme cold. One theory suggests that low levels of thiamine played a huge role, leading to neurological symptoms that made decision-making nearly impossible. You imagine the conversations, scientists arguing across decades, while somewhere in the background an explorer's ghost politely clears his throat, saying, "I can assure you, I didn't feel so great." As you walk, the snow begins to sparkle more intensely, not because the sun is brighter, but because your imagination is flicking little switches it shouldn't. You blink several times, realizing how easy it'd be for an exhausted explorer to misjudge distance, depth, or direction. Whiteout conditions could turn even a short walk into a wandering disaster. The Arctic plays optical tricks even on well-fed people. On starving ones, those tricks become illusions. You crouch down beside a small drift, running your hand across its feather-like ridges. The cold stings, but somehow it feels grounding. In the distance, you imagine a weary explorer, muttering to himself, trying to maintain a sense of humor, because humor, even strained and delirious, is one of the last things to leave us. Which leads naturally to your third joke. If you ever catch yourself telling knock-knock jokes to a frozen boot for morale, congratulations, you've unlocked the Polar Madness achievement. You straighten up, inhaling the sharp, icy air. Your breaths come slower now, matching the rhythm of the land. Hunger thickens your thoughts, making them wander like loose dogs across a snowy field. And yet, somehow, this wandering has its own kind of beauty. The Arctic has always been a place where the mind drifts, sometimes toward fear, sometimes toward wonder, sometimes toward the idea that maybe, just maybe, the snow does look tasty. Your footsteps continue across the quiet world, the swell of hunger tightening your stomach, the fog of exhaustion settling behind your eyes. And as the light dims ever so slightly, you feel the shifting landscape of your own thoughts, strange, soft, and a little too eager to imagine snacks where there are none. You push deeper into the Arctic silence, the wind brushing lightly against your coat like a bored cat demanding neither affection nor distance, just existing, mildly inconvenienced by your presence. Ahead, something solid breaks the smooth horizon. Sledges, long, wooden, weathered. They sit half buried in the snow, like forgotten bones of an expedition that tried very hard not to fall apart, but absolutely did. Your boots crunch slowly toward them, each step feeling heavier, not physically, but with the weight of what those sledges once carried. Supplies, equipment, scraps of hope, and dogs, lots of dogs. You stop beside the first sledge and kneel, brushing snow away from the curved wood. It creaks faintly, as if remembering the dozens of journeys it suffered through. Pulling a sledge across Arctic terrain was never easy. It meant hours, even days, of leaning into the harness, your body acting like a second engine when the four-legged engine grew tired or refused to cooperate. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Many Arctic expeditions relied heavily on dog teams, not only for hauling gear, but for speed and mobility. Without dogs, progress slowed to a crawl. You step around to the front of the sledge where the traces lie tangled in the snow, empty and still. You can almost picture the dogs that once stood here, thick-furred, sharp-eyed, their paws toughened by endless miles of ice. You hear phantom barks, playful and eager at first, slowly giving way to something quieter as rations dwindled. Hunger wasn't just a human problem out here. Sled dogs ate a lot, often more than the men, and when the food supply dried up, decisions had to be made. Hard decisions. The kind you don't talk about unless honesty outweighs pride. You run your fingers along a cracked harness, feeling the brittle leather beneath your gloves. It's then the first joke of this section slips in like a sleepy sigh. If dogs had Yelp, half these expeditions would have one-star reviews, reading, "Hard work, terrible management, no treats." You follow the imagined memories forward, picturing a line of exhausted men tugging at the sledge's wooden rails. When the dogs grew too weak to pull, the explorers took their place, Harnesses slipped over human shoulders, cinching tight. The cold bit into their bones as they leaned forward, trying to drag not just supplies, but the entire weight of survival behind them. The snow squeaked beneath their boots, and the ice groaned like an old ship. You step into one of the spots where a man might have stood, imagining the rope digging into your chest. It's surprisingly easy to feel small under that kind of imagined burden. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some explorers gave their dogs elaborate names like Satan, Mustache, or Snowball, depending on the animal's personality, because even on the frozen edge of the world, people still had time for drama. One diary described a dog named Bismarck, who was apparently convinced he was in charge and resented being contradicted. You smile softly, imagining an indignant husky lecturing his human teammates about proper route strategy. The wind shifts, carrying a sound that almost resembles mournful whining. You know it's just the ice settling. But in this place, imagination doesn't need much encouragement. Hunger, cold, fatigue. They all narrow the mind until everything feels symbolic. The sledges become more than tools. They become testaments to what people were willing to endure. Historians still argue whether expeditions should have relied so heavily on dog teams. Some say dogs were essential for Arctic travel. Others argue that explorers underestimated the amount of food required to keep their animals healthy, leading to predictable tragedy. You sense the truth is tangled somewhere in the middle, much like the harnesses before you. You walk behind the sledges, noticing something scribbled faintly on the wood, barely visible beneath frost. Tally marks. Not many, just enough to make your chest tighten. Perhaps distances measured, perhaps days survived, perhaps something else. You brush them gently and feel the story pull you deeper. You walk further, imagining the team of explorers huddled around their weakened dogs. The animals pant heavily, their ribs showing beneath thick fur. One man strokes a dog's head slowly, whispering something you can't quite hear. Hunger complicates everything. Not enough food for the men, not enough for the dogs, and eventually the line between companion and resource begins to blur in ways no one wants to acknowledge. Still, you move past that thought because the story isn't slowing down yet. You focus instead on the mechanical rhythm of sledge hauling. Boot, crunch, pull, breath, repeat, for hours, for days, sometimes for weeks without seeing the sun. Your shoulders instinctively hunch as though the imaginary rope is digging in again. The snow around you is strangely hypnotic, flattening the world into a palette of white and blue. The sledges cast long shadows, thin, trembling lines stretching across the ground. You notice how some runners are broken or splintered, maybe from hitting a hidden ridge of ice, maybe from collapsing under too much weight, maybe from someone kicking it out of frustration, because yes, humans have always coped with stress by kicking inanimate objects. That's the second joke for this section. Picture an explorer yelling, "I told you to turn left," at a wooden sledge that absolutely did not care. You kneel beside one of the runners, imagining the bitter, stinging cold seeping through gloves in seconds. Tools were often too cold to hold for long. Repairs had to be done quickly before fingers went numb. Even tightening a bolt could feel like defusing a bomb, except the bomb was your hand refusing to work correctly. In the distance, your eyes catch a faint line, maybe a trail made by dogs pacing restlessly, or men trudging forward, or perhaps both. You step toward it, hearing the rhythm of panting breaths and the crunch of snow. The imaginary dogs surge forward again, pulling the sledge with renewed energy, energy found in sheer survival instinct, not nourishment. You picture a man encouraging them with soft words, knowing deep down that each mile traveled is a mile closer to running out of options. A scholarly debate drifts into your mind. Did explorers overestimate the resilience of sled dogs, treating them as machines rather than living partners? Or were they simply overwhelmed by circumstances no planning could overcome? The argument continues even now, echoing across books and classrooms, and occasionally very intense YouTube comment sections. You stop beside the last sledge, looking down at a set of paw prints frozen in the ice, sharp-edged, preserved like a photograph locked in frost. You crouch, touching the indentation with gentle fingers. The print feels like a tiny memorial, a reminder that survival wasn't just a human struggle out here. The silence settles again, soft and heavy. You stand slowly, exhaling a cloud of breath that drifts upward like a fragile signal to skies that don't respond. And as you turn away from the sledges, the weight of desperation, determination, and the strange bond between humans and their dog teams lingers behind you, quiet, solemn, and still echoing faintly across the snow. You walk on, leaving the silent, snow-buried sledges behind, and something new pricks at your nose, an aroma so faint you almost think you imagined it. Smoke. Not the crisp, distant kind that drifts from a fire well tended, but the thin, uncertain smoke of a flame that's trying very hard to exist in a world determined to snuff it out. You follow it, drawn toward a small hollow in the snow, where a group of frost-bitten explorers once huddled around a battered pot. And tonight, you're about to learn something oddly practical, how to turn boots into soup. Again, but upgraded. You crouch near the remembered fire pit, noticing the charred stones arranged in a rough circle. Above them sits a metal pot, warped by the harshness of the cold and the desperation of its owners. You lean close, brushing snow away from the pot's rim, and feel a sense of camaraderie with whoever once stirred this strange meal. They weren't just surviving, they were innovating. Welcome to Boiling Boots 101. It's time to get hands-on. You pick up a strip of imaginary leather, stiff as a frozen plank. It bends only slightly before making a sound like a very offended door hinge. Explorers face this same dilemma. How do you take something that's meant to withstand harsh terrain and convince it to behave like dinner? A mainstream historical fact slides into your thoughts. Rawhide was often used for laces, straps, and bindings on sledges. Unlike tanned leather, rawhide, when softened by hours of boiling, could yield a gelatin-like substance containing a tiny bit of usable protein. Not much, but enough to keep a person upright. You drop the leather into the pot, watching it float awkwardly, like a reluctant swimmer entering a very judgmental pool. Someone once wrote in a journal that the first stage of boiling leather was a test of patience. No kidding. It could take hours just to get the stuff soft enough to cut without chipping a tooth. As the pot warms, the snow around you glows soft orange from the fragile flame underneath. The wind tries to interfere, but the explorers of the past shielded this tiny fire with their own bodies, shivering walls of wool and bone. A quirky tidbit bubbles up. Some explorers actually sprinkled snow into their leather stew to lighten the texture. Yes, they used snow as a seasoning. You shake your head slowly, thinking about how far your standards drop when hunger grips you. Snow as seasoning? What's next? Glacial ice as garnish? The pot begins to steam. You hear that first delicate hiss of leather warming, and you can't help but offer your first joke of this section. Somewhere, a high-end chef is crying because you're about to sous vide your footwear. You stir with a wooden spoon, imaginary of course, but vivid enough that you feel the softened edges scraping the bottom of the pot. Slowly, reluctantly, the leather begins to absorb water. It swells, becoming rubbery, then gelatinous in places. You lift a piece with the spoon and watch it wobble in a way that absolutely does not inspire confidence. The broth itself grows cloudy, thickening slightly as the tannins leach out, tinting the water a sad, tea-like brown. You lean in closer, inhaling the scent. It's earthy, bitter, and reminiscent of wet bark. You look into the pot and wonder whether the fashion industry knows their products can double as survival stew. Not that anyone's rushing to add this recipe to the winter catalog. Historians still argue whether eating leather actually provided meaningful nutrition, or whether it simply gave starving explorers something warm to put in their stomachs. Some claimed the gelatin helped a little. Others said the process removed nearly everything usable, leaving behind only flavorless fiber. Whatever the truth, the symbolism mattered. Boiling boots was a declaration that you weren't giving up. Not yet. An explorer's shadow seems to settle beside you. You can almost see him kneeling, his hands red and cracked from the cold, his breath shaky as he watches the pot simmer. Maybe he breaks off a tiny strip, tests it cautiously, then winces because it still has the texture of a wallet that refuses to be eaten. You imagine him tossing it back in, muttering under his breath about needing just 10 more minutes, the Arctic equivalent of waiting for pasta to reach al dente. You shift your position, warming your gloved hands near the low flame. Fire was precious here. Fuel was scarce, wood almost non-existent, and blubber or fat too valuable to waste. Sometimes they burned scraps of rope, bits of canvas, or driftwood carried by improbable currents. Every spark carried meaning. You picture yourself leaning forward, guarding the flame as if it were a newborn, because without it, even the idea of boiled boots becomes impossible. The leather finally gives in, soft enough to cut, though still stretchy enough to bounce back at you with surprising enthusiasm. You grip it between 2 fingers and tug. It resists stubbornly. That's when your second joke glides into place. If your dinner can fight back, you're probably not dining at a Michelin-starred restaurant. You cut the leather into smaller strips, each one wobbling like a tired lasagna noodle. Dropping them back into the pot, you stir gently, imagining how explorers whispered about adding spices if they were lucky enough to have anything resembling seasoning left. Sometimes that meant scraping the bottom of a pemmican bag for crumbs. Sometimes it meant nothing at all. And occasionally, very rarely, someone would find a forgotten onion or a lump of grease. In those moments, morale soared. It wasn't just about flavor. It was about remembering civilization. Sweat trickles down your temple despite the cold, because the fire's heat is real in your imagination, and the concentration is real too. You understand, maybe for the first time, how cooking becomes a ritual of hope. Boiling leather wasn't just necessity, it was a statement. We will make something from nothing. We will keep going. A scholarly debate surfaces. Some argue that the act of cooking, even strange meals, helped maintain structure and purpose within groups. Others suggest it merely delayed the inevitable exhaustion. But you sense a subtler truth. Cooking gave explorers a moment of control in a landscape that defied it. You dip your spoon into the thickened broth, lifting it to your lips. The taste is bitter, smoky, and slightly salty from sweat that probably dripped in during stirring. You try not to think about that part. You swallow. It warms your stomach in a slow, spreading wave. The broth isn't pleasant, but it's something. And something is everything in the Arctic. One last joke completes your required trio. Congratulations! You've just completed the most unappetizing cooking class in history. If you ever open a restaurant, please don't put boot stew on the menu. The pot hisses softly as you set the spoon down, steam curling upward. You sit back on your heels, feeling the warmth radiate toward your face, and for a moment, the Arctic doesn't feel quite as vast, not quite as empty. A tiny fire, a battered pot, a slowly boiling piece of leather. These became lifelines. And as you stand and brush snow from your coat, you understand why. Survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's just dinner. You rise from the little hollow of melting snow and step back into the wind, though wind hardly captures it. Up here, the air feels like it's sharpening itself on purpose, drawing cold blades across your cheeks. You tug your hood forward and keep moving. Ahead, a faint flicker of orange catches your eye. Another fire, or what's left of one. The flame stutters like it's telling you, I'm doing my best, okay? And honestly, same. As you arrive, you notice the remnants of a campsite half swallowed by snowdrifts. Bits of canvas ripple weakly. A few metal tins lie scattered nearby, their edges frosted over. But your eyes settle on something else. Gloves, hanging on a stick over the fire like tiny frozen flags of surrender. And suddenly, you understand why this stretch of your journey feels different. Tonight, you're stepping into the delicate balance between frostbite and firelight. The thin line every Arctic explorer walked with their fingers, toes, and sanity. You kneel by the sputtering flame, extending your hands. The heat surprises you, not because it's warm, but because it's so inconsistent. One side of your hand warms while the other stays numb. The air steals heat as fast as the fire gives it. A mainstream historical fact bubbles up. Frostbite was one of the most common injuries during Arctic expeditions. Explorers often woke with fingers stiff and pale, or toes gone numb beyond recovery. And once frostbite set in, even the simplest tasks, tying a knot, buckling a strap, lighting a lamp, became Herculean chores. You hold your hands near the flame until you feel a faint tingle, that painfully familiar burn of thawing skin. You wince. That's when the first joke of this section slips in. If you ever want to experience the Arctic from home, just stick your hands in the freezer for 5 minutes, then try texting without autocorrect. Congratulations, now you're an honorary explorer. You stand and move toward a collapsed tent, brushing away snow. Inside sits an explorer, thin, tired, his face wind-chapped. He holds his hand in front of the fire, watching the color come back slowly. But there's a danger in warming up too fast. Skin damaged by frostbite can blister, swell, or even crack under sudden heat. You imagine him pulling his hand back quickly, muttering something frustrated yet resigned. The Arctic rarely offered comfort without conditions. You notice a length of seal oil-soaked wick nearby, charred at one end. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was life insurance, a tiny circle of control in a world of relentless cold. But fuel was scarce. Some expeditions burned blubber. Others used whatever wood they could glean from the rare drift logs. Sometimes they even burned parts of their own sledges. Talk about choosing between warmth and mobility. You crouch beside the fire, stirring the embers with a stick. Sparks drift upward like little orange fireflies trying to escape the cold. A quirky tidbit drifts into memory. Some explorers claim they could hear their frost-bitten noses crackle when they warmed up too fast. Yes, crackle. You instinctively reach up and touch your own nose just in case. It's still intact, but now you're thinking about it way too much. You sit near the collapsed tent flap, gazing out at the dim horizon. Your fingers tingle again. You rub them gently against your palms, trying to restore full feeling. Frostbite wasn't just a physical danger, it also played tricks on the mind. Numbness made it hard to judge how injured you really were. Some explorers removed gloves because their fingers felt warm, even when reality said otherwise. That creeping confusion between sensation and truth becomes its own kind of threat. Historians still argue whether mental lapses from cold exposure or hunger contributed more to frostbite. Some say the cold dulled judgment, others insist the lack of calories made explorers careless. You listen to both ideas floating in your mind as you watch the flame dance, unsure which seems more convincing. Maybe both. Arctic suffering rarely had a single cause. You rise and step out into the open again, trudging toward the remains of another fire pit half buried in drifted snow. Imagine the explorers sitting here after a long day's march, letting the fire trace warm stripes across their faces. For a moment, you see one man lifting his boot toward the flame, trying to thaw a toe that hasn't felt anything for hours. He holds it there gingerly, almost reverently. When the heat touches his skin, he overreacts, jerking his leg back violently and muttering a creative string of early 19th century complaints. And there's your second joke. Nothing wakes you up faster than discovering your toes are staging a coup. You wander toward a patch of ice that glints strangely, catching the firelight in a fractured mosaic. Kneeling, you scrape away frost until you find a frozen footprint. Bare. Someone stepped out without boots. Not far. Only a few feet. Maybe they thought they'd dropped something. Maybe they were delirious. Maybe they simply forgot. That's the terrifying thing. Cold erases awareness. You pull your own boots tighter around your feet instinctively. You return to the fire circle, warming your hands again. The flame answers with soft crackles. You allow your shoulders to relax, imagining the explorers doing the same at the end of each day. Conversations around Arctic fires were often quiet, spoken through chattering teeth. Men discussed routes, weather, loved ones, and sometimes nothing at all, letting the silence say what their drained voices couldn't. A scholarly debate flickers across your mind. Some researchers argue that the psychological comfort of fire was more important than its heat. Others contend the opposite. You suspect the truth blends together, like most things in the Arctic. Fire was warmth, yes, but it was also a boundary between life and the cold that waited just inches beyond the glow. You stand one last time, watching the flames shrink and flutter. The light flickers against your coat. Your fingertips are warm but tender. As the fire dwindles, you step back into the widening dark. The world beyond the orange glow feels colder now, but it also feels larger, emptier, and eerily beautiful. Here comes your third joke, soft and sleepy. If humans were truly meant to live in the Arctic, we'd have built-in heated socks. But we don't. So instead we boil boots and huddle by flames that look like they're questioning their life choices. You take one slow breath, then another. The fire behind you sighs into embers, and as you continue into the quiet night, the contrast between warmth and cold becomes your steady companion, one flicker at a time. You move away from the dying embers, letting the last glow slip behind you until the darkness settles again, soft, heavy, and pulsing with the distant creaks of shifting ice. The sky above is a slate-gray dome, and the land around you blurs into an unbroken sweep of white. Your boots crunch forward, steady and slow, and soon the faint silhouette of something angular rises ahead. Not a tent, not a sledge, something flatter, broader, almost geometric. It takes a few more steps before you realize what you're approaching. A bundle of maps tied with a strip of frozen rope, half buried in snow, as if the Arctic itself decided their optimism was too bold and gently tucked them away. You crouch beside them, brushing frost from the top sheet. The corners are stiff, and the ink has bled in places from humidity and cold. You lift the brittle paper carefully, almost reverently, because these maps once carried the dreams of entire expeditions, and tonight you're stepping straight into the world of cartographic hope, myth, and miscalculation. You spread a map across your knee. The paper crackles like dry leaves. The lines drawn across it look confident, solid strokes of ink, neatly marking coastlines and channels that the explorers wished existed. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Many 19th century Arctic explorers relied on earlier charts that included speculative geography, sometimes outright guesses, because the polar regions remained largely uncharted. Entire expeditions were launched based on assumptions, rumors, and the occasional whaling captain's enthusiastic storytelling. You glance at one jagged coastline marked boldly as likely passage. You can't help but smile because nothing in that phrase inspires confidence. It's like labeling a bridge possibly sturdy and still trying to drive a truck across it. And with that, joke number one arrives. Imagine trusting your life to a map that basically says, "Here be vibes." You stand holding the map up to the dim Arctic light. The wind snaps at the edges. Some routes marked here lead straight into dead ends, places where ice crushes ships like toys, where channels that seemed open one summer became frozen wastelands the next. You picture an explorer early in the journey tracing these lines with excitement. We'll go here, then straight through this convenient gap the map definitely didn't invent. Historians still argue how much wishful thinking played into these designs. Some claim cartographers genuinely believed the Arctic held open water routes, warmed by ocean currents. Others suggest these ideas were political conveniences, encouraging governments to fund expeditions by promising smooth sailing. The inked lines blur in your vision for a moment, and you imagine two scholars, decades later, arguing over a faded atlas like it's a cryptic treasure map. You kneel again, noticing another bundle of documents nearby, notes scribbled in hurried handwriting. Journals, maybe. Survey drafts, weather logs. You pick one up and study it. The handwriting wobbles slightly, probably from cold-numbed fingers. There's a description of a mountain range sighted in the distance, except, with a strange clarity, that the mountains were likely clouds resting on the horizon. Polar mirages fooled many crews into thinking land lay ahead. Some even recorded entire islands that no one has seen since. A quirky tidbit flickers into your mind. One such phantom island, Crockerland, was reported by an explorer who swore he saw land rising from the sea ice. Later expeditions confirmed it was nothing but an optical illusion, an entire island born from a mirage. You look up at the hazy horizon now and think, yep, I could fall for that too. You tuck the notes back into the snow and move on, your boots crunching like punctuation marks in this ongoing story. A few yards away, you spot another map pinned under a rock. This one shows a snaking line of ink marked open water. You bend over it, letting your fingers trail across the path. The explorers who carried this must have felt hopeful, buoyant even, a shortcut, a break, a route the ice might allow. But the Arctic is a creature of moods. Sometimes the ice parted, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it closed in behind ships like jaws. You imagine the moment the explorers reached where this open water should have been, and instead found a wall of ice stretching to the horizon. The disappointment would have been crushing. You rise and walk a little further, imagining the explorers huddled over their maps at night, debating routes with the intensity of students cramming for an exam. One believes the Western Channel is open. Another insists the northern path shows promise. A third just wants to sleep. And then someone brings out a sextant, claiming the stars will settle the argument, when in reality, cloud cover and perpetual twilight would have made stargazing about as effective as navigating by vibes alone. Your second sleepy joke drifts into place. You picture an explorer squinting at his compass, tapping it, muttering, "North is broken." Again. Honestly, relatable. A gentle snow begins to fall, each flake swirling in slow motion. You pause, letting them melt against your coat. The maps rustle faintly in your hands. You imagine long discussions around fires about mythical warm currents, about the possibility of land beyond the ice, about legends whispered by sailors, stories of hidden islands, open seas, or entire civilizations untouched by the cold. Historians debate whether these myths hindered or motivated exploration. Some argue they misled crews into danger. Others insist myth-making is what kept humans pushing boundaries in the first place. You tilt your head, considering both sides. Maybe the Arctic needed to feel like a mystery for people to risk everything searching it. You walk onward, holding the last map for a moment before letting it go. The wind snatches it instantly, sending it tumbling across the snow until it disappears like a misplaced hope. You watch it vanish and think about the explorers marching forward even when the maps failed them, even when the world refused to match the ink. Your third joke arrives softly, almost hidden in your breath. If Google Maps existed back then, it would have said, "Recalculating forever." You continue your slow trek across the frozen plain, the memory of those maps lingering behind you. Inaccurate coastlines, phantom islands, imaginary passages, all reminders that the Arctic wasn't just a place to explore. It was a place that pushed back against being known. And as you walk deeper into the shimmering nothingness, you realize something important. In the Arctic, the unknown wasn't a flaw on the map. It was the map. You let the last of the wind-tossed maps fade into the twilight behind you, stepping deeper into a world where the horizon feels closer, tighter, as if the sky itself has wrapped around the land like a heavy wool cloak. The Arctic grows quiet, not empty quiet, but a gentle, humming stillness that seems to listen to you breathe. And up ahead, tucked into a small windbreak carved by drifting snow, you spot a faint glow. Not the sharp flicker of fire this time, but something softer, rounder, like the reflection of lamplight inside canvas. You move closer, drawn toward the warm hum of voices, not loud, not cheerful exactly, but steady, comforting in that tired way people speak when they've run out of strength for anything else. As you approach, the smell of seal oil lamps reaches you, faintly greasy but strangely soothing in this frozen world. You crouch beside the tent flap and slip inside, letting the dim glow and muffled warmth wrap around you like a thick blanket. Inside, a cluster of explorers sits shoulder to shoulder, bundled in layers that still don't seem quite enough. Their breath clouds the air, their faces look thin, but their eyes, there's something alive there, something stubborn. This is the place where morale survives, not with cheers or speeches, but with whispered stories told by moonlight. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. Arctic expeditions often relied on storytelling, songs, and nightly reading sessions to keep spirits alive through long stretches of darkness. Some commanders required daily morale rituals, understanding that mental survival was just as important as physical endurance. So here you are, sinking into that circle, feeling the flicker of hope held together by human voices. One man begins a story in a low, steady tone. It's a tale from home, about summer fields glowing gold under the sun, about laughter echoing across warm evenings. Another explorer chuckles softly, adding a detail, exaggerating something, turning the memory into a shared world they can step into for a few precious minutes. You close your eyes and let the images drift through your mind. Warm grass, running water, fresh bread. Everything the Arctic refuses to give. The first quiet joke of this section slips in like a warm exhale. One explorer admits he misses the taste of apples so much he once tried biting a snowball and pretending. "Did it work?" someone asks. He shrugs. "Only if you squint." You smile, because of course hunger warps humor. But in this tent, even the smallest laugh becomes a treasure. Someone else begins humming, a low, rolling tune that sounds like a lullaby mixed with a sea shanty. The others join in, their voices thin but earnest. You let the sound wash over you, feeling how music cuts through the cold. It stirs something warm inside your chest. Camp songs were a lifeline in these places, tiny anchors pulling minds away from despair. You look up toward the small round window where the moonlight filters in, soft and blurred by frost. The moon hangs low, glowing like a pale lantern above the ice. Its light touches each explorer's face, outlining tired features with silver. You imagine this light being their companion through endless dark nights, because in the Arctic winter, daylight isn't something you count on. Moonlight becomes the makeshift substitute for hope. A quirky tidbit pops into your thoughts. Some explorers believe singing kept frostbite away. There's no science behind it, of course, but they insisted the vibration stimulated circulation. So you picture a half-frozen man belting out a tune not because he wanted to, but because he really wanted to keep all 10 fingers. The singing fades, leaving a comfortable silence. Someone clears his throat and begins telling a ghost story. Of course they did. Humans can't help it. We tell ghost stories everywhere, even in places where real dangers already surround us. You lean in, letting the tale carry you. A lone explorer wandering through a whiteout. Strange footsteps behind him, a flicker of movement in the distance. Is it real? Is it imagination? The storyteller leaves the question hanging. Historians still argue whether explorers genuinely saw strange things in the dark, or whether hallucinations from starvation and exhaustion fueled these tales. Some accounts mention mysterious lights, shadowy figures, even phantom ships. You think about Section 4 and smile slowly. The Arctic loves messing with your mind. Another story follows, a funny one this time. A man recalls the day he accidentally spilled hot tea on his leg and was thrilled because it meant he could actually feel something. The tent erupts in tired laughter. This gives you your second joke. One explorer claims the highlight of his month was finding a biscuit that wasn't completely frozen. It was like chewing hope, he says dramatically. The others groan and laugh because apparently drama thrives even in sub-zero temperatures. Someone reaches into a pocket and pulls out a small worn book, pages curled, cover cracked. Maybe poetry, maybe scripture, maybe a collection of sentimental quotes someone's sister stuffed into his pack. Reading aloud becomes ritualistic, a moment of shared stillness where every voice hushes. You catch a few soft lines drifting through the tent, mixing with the hiss of the oil lamp. And suddenly, the Arctic feels less like a monstrous void and more like a cathedral of ice, listening quietly. You settle deeper into the circle, letting the warmth of bodies and breath ease your shoulders. Conversations grow softer. Someone talks about home cooking, bread just out of the oven, stew bubbling on the stove. Another mentions his dog waiting back home. Someone else speaks of a sweetheart. These words don't solve hunger or cold, but they soften their edges, letting the men rest in a mental space warmer than their surroundings. A scholarly debate rises into your awareness. Some researchers believe morale was the most important factor determining whether expeditions succeeded. Others argue that practical needs, food, shelter, navigation, mattered far more. But sitting here, inside this dimly lit tent, you sense both are inseparable. You need food to survive, yes, but you also need reasons to wake up, to walk, to hope. The lamp flickers, casting shapes against the canvas. You watch the shadows dance, the silhouettes of hands, boots, sharp profiles softened by exhaustion. The tent seems to breathe with the wind. Outside, the moon continues its quiet vigil. Someone yawns. Another mutters a drowsy joke about wishing the moon would drop a snack or two. Your third required joke? At this point, he says softly, I'd accept moon cheese. A few smiles ripple around the group. Gradually, the cluster of men shifts. Shoulders slump, heads nod. The stories taper off into murmurs, then silence. The lamp dims further, barely glowing. You stand quietly and slip back outside, letting the flap fall behind you. The cold hits you instantly, sharp and clear. But something inside you feels warmer, like you've carried a small ember out of the tent. The moon hangs above you, steady and bright. And as you continue walking through the pale light, you sense the low hum of morale, fragile, flickering, but alive, guiding your steps through the endless night. You move away from the quiet halo of moonlit morale and feel the cold settle a little more firmly into your coat, as if it's politely reminding you who's really in charge out here. The Arctic doesn't raise its voice. Oh no, it simply leans in, presses a chilled fingertip to your neck, and waits for you to shiver. You oblige, and as you walk, your steps bring you toward a low rise in the snow where a few tattered tents once stood, barely clinging to the ground like exhausted creatures refusing to be blown away. You approach one of them, a sagging canvas shelter shaped vaguely like a defeated pyramid, and slip through the flap. Inside, the air is slightly warmer. Though warmer here means less aggressively icy. Your breath fogs the dim space. The tent smells faintly of wool, smoke, and unwashed socks having an existential crisis. But more than the scent, you feel something else lingering, tension so thick it's practically wearing a parka. This is where explorers learned the delicate art of teamwork under conditions designed specifically to ruin teamwork. You settle onto a crate, or what feels like a crate, and let your eyes adjust. A few men once lived in this cramped wedge of fabric, sharing space, supplies, and moods. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Many expeditions discovered that interpersonal conflict was one of the greatest challenges. Being trapped in a small shelter for months, sharing limited food and zero privacy, pushed even well-disciplined crews to snap at each other over the tiniest things, like snoring, or someone eating too loudly, or someone looking at them with insufficient cheerfulness. You imagine one man lying here, trying to sleep, while another rustles through his pack, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. You picture someone else sighing dramatically, a universal sign of, "I'm annoyed but trying to look noble," in an environment where survival depended on cooperation. Every breath became a group project. Your first joke of this section sneaks in softly. If group projects in school were frustrating, imagine them minus heat, snacks, and the option to go home and complain to your mom. Congratulations. You're now on an Arctic expedition. You shift your weight, bumping gently into the tent wall. The whole structure shivers like a startled cat. In storms, tents could collapse, threatening to bury a crew under snow. That meant keeping everything tight, ropes tied, poles secure, tempers steadier than fingers numbed by frostbite. But tempers didn't always stay steady. Arguments flared over rationing, navigation choices, workloads, or simply because someone exhaled wrong. A quirky tidbit pops up. Some expeditions assigned humorous or exaggerated titles. Chief Biscuit Officer, Supreme Snow Shoveler, just to keep morale up and give people a reason to laugh at themselves. You imagine one man solemnly performing his duties as master of socks, carefully inspecting footgear with the air of someone handling diplomatic documents. You stretch your legs a little inside the tent. But even that movement feels intrusive in such close quarters. The explorers lived practically on top of each other, elbows touching, boots knocking, the tent rustling whenever anyone twitched. Shared hardship binds people, yes, but it also rubs personalities together until sparks fly. Historians still argue whether hierarchical leadership or distributed responsibility worked best in the Arctic. Some believe strict discipline kept crews alive. Others think flexibility and shared decision-making prevented mutiny-level frustration. You imagine a commander trying to mediate a debate about who gets the last cup of warm water, wondering privately if leading an expedition is just extreme babysitting. Outside, the wind thumps gently against the canvas. Inside, you picture men sprawled in uneven rows, their breath rising in pale clouds. Someone grumbles about the cold. Someone else insists it's warmer than yesterday. The truth is irrelevant. Comfort comes from believing the story that makes you feel stronger. You inch closer to the imaginary stove at the center of the tent, a small iron contraption that radiates as much heat as a determined candle. You hold your hands toward it anyway, savoring the faintest warmth. This tiny heater was the heart of every shelter, though it had a mischievous side. Too much heat and the tent filled with condensation. Too little and frost crept in like a passive-aggressive roommate. Your second joke lands here like a sleepy sigh. Imagine arguing with someone while icicles are literally forming on your eyebrows. Honestly, nobody is winning that fight. You glance to your right at a small pile of shared gear, ropes, sewing kits, tools. In a tent this small, no one had their own space. Personal belongings became communal by necessity, which meant socks went missing, spoons got borrowed temporarily, read forever, and occasionally someone tucked a biscuit under their sleeping bag only to wake and find it frozen solid. Not stolen, just uncooperative. The psychological strain begins to settle in around you. Tiny annoyances grew enormous when mixed with hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Someone snoring could feel like a moral failing. Someone coughing could sound like sabotage. And yet, these same cramped conditions also built fierce loyalty. When you depend on someone to keep you alive, you forgive more than you otherwise could. A scholarly debate rises quietly. Did Arctic teamwork rely more on personal bonds or strict discipline? Some journals describe crewmates becoming closer than brothers. Others reveal bitter divisions that lasted long after the expedition ended. You picture both realities living side by side in this tent, depending on the day, the weather, or the size of breakfast. As you prepare to leave, you feel the tent closing in a little, the air heavy with imagined frustration and camaraderie. The walls flutter softly, a sleeping bag rustles, a soft curse muttered in the corner dissolves into a tired laugh. Someone shares a story. Someone else passes around a scrap of ration as if it were a feast. These tiny gestures held teams together when everything else fell apart. Outside again, you breathe deeply, the cold biting but refreshing after the closeness of the tent. The wind carries away the lingering tension, replacing it with quiet snowflakes drifting in spirals. Your final joke arrives like a warm puff of humor. Teamwork makes the dream work, unless the dream is stay warm and don't starve, in which case teamwork mostly prevents someone from getting smacked with a frozen mitten. You take a few steps into the open, the tent fading behind you. The Arctic stretches out again, wide, silent, merciless. But now you know something important. Survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about learning to fit entire personalities, flaws and all, into a space the size of a walk-in closet, and somehow still wake up willing to help each other. You keep walking, feeling the weight and warmth of that realization settle into your stride. You walk on through the quiet, the cold humming softly around you like a white noise machine set to Arctic Expedition Extreme Difficulty Edition. Ahead, the horizon curves gently upward, revealing a cluster of scattered objects half buried in snow, odd shapes, irregular lumps, nothing like the purposeful tents or sledges you've passed before. These look accidental, dropped, misplaced by numb fingers or forgotten during storms. And as you draw closer, you realize you've entered a place less about survival and more about curiosity. Scientific curiosity, stubborn and persistent even when everything else was falling apart. You stoop beside the first object, a small wooden box with iron fittings. Its lid hangs open, the hinges stiff with frost. Inside, you see glass vials, some shattered, others intact but clouded. Soil samples, pebbles, scraps of frozen moss. Things an explorer once collected not because they would save lives, but because they held knowledge. And in the Arctic, knowledge was one of the few luxuries they refused to abandon. A mainstream historical fact slips easily into place. Many polar expeditions were scientific missions as much as navigational ones. Crews measured magnetic fields, charted coastlines, recorded wildlife, and took samples of anything that might reveal secrets about Earth's coldest corners. Even Franklin's doomed expedition carried hundreds of pounds of scientific instruments, chronometers, barometers, sextants, specimen boxes, because discovery mattered as deeply as survival. You lift a tiny frozen plant fragment between your fingers, just a sliver of green preserved in ice, like a pressed memory. You imagine the man who tucked it carefully into his journal, noting its structure, its location, its improbable existence in a place where plants rarely dared to show up. You picture him smiling faintly in the middle of the endless white, pleased with this improbable find. Your first joke of the section arrives with a fond exhale. If Arctic explorers had Instagram, half their posts would be icy selfies, and the other half close-ups of rocks captioned, Day 97, Found another rock. Thrilling. You stand and wander a little further, noticing metal stakes poking from the snow, markers for measurements perhaps. One has a small slate board tied to it, though whatever was written there has long since faded. You imagine two scientists arguing about magnetic declination while their eyelashes froze together, or someone declaring triumphantly that they'd found a pattern in the ice formations, only for wind to immediately erase the evidence. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your thoughts. Some expeditions brought along taxidermy kits so they could preserve animals they discovered, or, occasionally, animals they relied on for food. Picture it. One moment a man is boiling his boot for dinner. The next, he's meticulously stuffing a bird specimen for scientific posterity. Arctic priorities were flexible like that. You kneel beside an abandoned notebook, its pages fused together by moisture and time. The outermost page has bled ink, but you can make out a few words. Observation, latitude, ice pressure, severe, possible ridge collapse. You run your glove across the frozen surface. The handwriting looks tired, yet precise, the kind made by someone whose fingers are numb, but whose curiosity refuses to numb with them. Historians still argue whether these scientific pursuits helped or hindered survival. Some claim the focus on research distracted crews from urgent dangers. Others insist that documentation kept their minds sharp and provided structure in chaos. You stand in the snow, considering both sides. It's strange and beautiful, isn't it? Choosing to study the world even as it tries to kill you. You walk toward a small rise where the snow has drifted around an object with sharper angles. A metal tripod juts from the ice at an awkward tilt, half swallowed by drifts. Attached is an instrument, maybe a theodolite, maybe something custom-built for polar observation. You brush frost from its edges, marveling at the craftsmanship. Even now you can almost hear an explorer muttering proudly about calibration, even while shivering hard enough to rattle his teeth. Nearby lies a pair of goggles, glass cracked, leather straps stiff. These weren't for snow blindness, they were for observation in blizzards or during delicate measurements. You lift them briefly, holding them up to the grayish sky. The cracks distort the view, turning the Arctic into a splintered painting. Your second required joke falls gently. Imagine being tasked with precise measurements while your fingers feel like frozen fish sticks. Truly, the science alone deserves applause. As you continue forward, your steps lead you toward a scatter of bones, tiny ones, delicate. Bird remains. You kneel, recognizing the shape of wings folded by time. An explorer probably dissected this bird carefully, taking notes on its diet or feathers or flight patterns. Then, lacking other options, he might have eaten what remained. The circle of life, rendered Arctic style. You straighten up slowly and notice another curious thing, a small metal tin with a narrow brush inside, ink for sketches. Many explorers drew the world around them, ice ridges, auroras, wildlife, often with astonishing detail. Some of those drawings survive today, haunting in their quiet precision. You imagine the artist huddled in a tent, lit dimly by an oil lamp, sketching quickly before the cold stiffened his hands. A scholarly debate nudges into your awareness. Did the drive to document the Arctic stem from scientific hunger or from existential reassurance? After all, recording the world around you is another way of saying, I was here, I saw this meant something. Perhaps both motivations lived side by side in these frozen journals. You step up onto a ridge of ice, crunching across its brittle crest. Below, more artifacts glitter faintly beneath the surface. Tin cups, fragments of glass, maybe even a compass. The Arctic preserves everything and nothing, keeping some things pristine and devouring others without warning. You take one last slow look at the scattered evidence of scientific curiosity and the gently absurd resilience behind it, even in starvation, even in storms, even when their boots became dinner. These explorers kept collecting, measuring, recording. Because humans are strange creatures, we want to understand the world, even as it tries to erase us. Your third joke comes softly, drifting like a snowflake. If curiosity killed the cat, it definitely would have sent the cat to the Arctic with a notebook. You breathe out, watching your breath drift across the frozen landscape like a ghost of your own thoughts. Then you begin walking again, carrying with you the quiet spark of human wonder that somehow survived where almost nothing else could. You leave behind the scattered scientific instruments, little frozen monuments to curiosity, and step into a stretch of land where the world feels noticeably darker, quieter, and somehow deeper. The air doesn't just chill your face, it sinks into your shoulders, your chest, even your thoughts. The horizon looks closer now, as if distance itself has pulled inward for warmth. And as the gray sky gradually deepens into blue-black, you realize you're entering a long night, the kind that doesn't end at sunrise because sunrise has decided to take a sabbatical. Up here, winter isn't a cycle. It's a season that behaves like an over-enthusiastic roommate who overstays their welcome by several months. The sun disappears, slipping below the horizon and staying gone for weeks, then months. That's what the early Arctic explorers faced. Darkness not measured in hours, but in entire chapters of their journey. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind like a slow-moving aurora. During the polar night, the sun doesn't rise at all above the horizon, not even a sliver, not even a shy good morning. Instead, the world glows faintly at midday with a kind of extended twilight, blue, eerie, and beautifully unsettling. You take a few more steps, the cold crunch of your boots sounding louder in this vast, muffled silence. The sky above shifts into a deep, velvety shade that would look romantic anywhere else. But here, it feels like the ceiling of some immense cathedral carved from shadow. Stars begin to appear, sharp and steady, as though the night is pinning them into place. You breathe in, slow and deliberate. The darkness brings a quiet so profound it almost hums, and with it comes a strange sense of drifting. You imagine the explorers, months into their journey, stepping outside their tents to a world with no sunrise to look forward to, no natural markers of time, only the endless, gentle hum of winter. Your first sleepy little joke arrives like a whispered aside. If you've ever forgotten what day it is after a long weekend, imagine doing that for 3 straight months in a freezer. Congratulations, you're now experiencing the Arctic calendar. You keep walking, feeling the shifting snow under your boots. In the kind of darkness that stretches on forever, time starts to stretch too. Days blend, hours lose meaning, and sleep doesn't follow a pattern so much as a whim. Some explorers tried to maintain routines, reading schedules, meal times, even mock sunrise rituals. But the dark seeped in anyway. It always does. Historians still argue whether the polar night had a bigger psychological impact than starvation. Some accounts describe men becoming lethargic, withdrawn, or restless to the point of near madness. Others found comfort in the calm, adapting surprisingly well. You tilt your head, imagining both possibilities floating around you like 2 quiet shadows. You stop near a shallow depression in the snow, a place where men once gathered to check their instruments, plan their routes, or simply remind themselves that the world still existed. You kneel, brushing your glove across the surface, and feel the cold nip at your fingertips. In the dark, explorers often lost track of direction. Compasses acted strangely near the magnetic pole, and without sunlight, even the bravest navigator could feel suddenly small. A quirky tidbit arrives. Some crews mark their own tents with flags or lanterns because men would occasionally wander in circles, only feet from camp, convinced they were miles away. Imagine the frustration of realizing you've been lost in your own backyard. At least here, backyard is entirely snow, so everything looks suspiciously similar. You stand again, turning slowly toward the sweeping sky. Stars glitter in impossible numbers, and among them dance faint ribbons of green and pink. The aurora borealis ripples gently overhead, casting a shy glow across the land like a soft watercolor brushstroke. It's fragile yet vast, eerie and comforting at the same time. You let the faint glow wash across your face. Imagine the explorers stepping outside to see this display, their jaws slack with awe despite the bone-deep cold. The northern lights weren't just beautiful. They were a reminder that the sky still worked. The universe still moved. Some men felt encouraged by the spectacle. Others found it unsettling, like a sign they were drifting into a world that didn't quite belong to humans. Your second slow-blooming joke slips in. If the northern lights were a screensaver, the Arctic was the computer that refused to shut down properly. You walk forward, letting the color-shifting sky guide your steps. The darkness deepens around you. Not threateningly, more like a thick blanket wrapping around your shoulders, urging you to walk a little slower. Time becomes syrupy here, stretching in long, quiet waves. Explorers compensated with routines. Some read aloud in tents to maintain a sense of order. Others took meticulous notes. Others carved or whittled small objects, letting their hands stay busy to keep the shadows from crowding their thoughts. Journals from these periods reveal entries full of introspection, longing, and sometimes surprising clarity. A scholarly debate nudges at the edge of your thoughts. Were these quiet months of darkness the most dangerous part of Arctic exploration, or were they a psychological reprieve from the frantic pace of the summer trek? Reading different accounts is like listening to 2 camps whisper across the years. The dark saved us, says one. The dark changed us, says the other. You keep walking. Eventually you pause, noticing footprints leading in broad arcs across the snow. They loop, they double back, they wander. You follow them, tracing the meandering pattern until you realize the truth. Someone walked here without direction, just to move, just to feel the world underneath them. In a place where time dissolves, motion becomes anchor. Your third gentle joke floats into the quiet. Imagine explaining to your friends, I didn't get lost. I was just directionally experimenting. You smile softly to yourself. The long night could swallow days whole. But it also created moments like this, moments where silence felt sacred and the sky whispered its own cold lullaby. You take one last look at the star-flung heavens, breathing in the quiet. Then, with your footsteps cushioned by a universe of snow, you continue through the long, gentle dark, guided not by sunlight, but by the steady glow of your own resolve. You leave the velvet dark of the long night behind, at least a little, because the sky is beginning to lighten in a way that feels more like a suggestion than a promise. A pale glow lingers at the horizon, not quite sunrise, not quite starlight, just a dim reminder that the world still cycles, even if the Arctic prefers to take its time. You turn your face toward that faint shimmer and start walking again, your boots sinking into snow that sighs beneath each step, soft in some places, treacherously rigid in others, and soon the terrain begins to change. The smooth, endless expanse fractures, splits, breaks into a chaotic mosaic of jagged blocks and glittering ridges, sea ice, real sea ice, alive in its own quiet, groaning way. It stretches in frozen waves, rising and falling like the surface of an ocean caught mid-breath. You take a slow step forward, feeling the surface shift ever so slightly beneath your boot, and suddenly you understand why this was the place where fates could turn in an instant. A mainstream historical fact emerges from the cold. Countless Arctic expeditions were waylaid or destroyed by shifting sea ice. Ships crushed, camps swallowed, men forced to detour dozens, sometimes hundreds, of miles, because the solid ground they counted on was just a temporary illusion. And here you are, stepping onto that very illusion with the gentle confidence of someone who hopes the ice is in a cooperative mood tonight. You test the surface. It gives a faint crackle, not loud, but enough to make your shoulders tighten. Ahead, the ice forms a narrow pathway between two towering ridges. You picture explorers threading routes like this daily, calculating each step, listening for creaks, praying the ice didn't shift beneath them. You follow the imagined trail until the cracks form a faint web-like pattern beneath your feet. Beautiful, terrifying, like walking across a stained glass window held up by nothing but stubbornness and cold. Your first required joke slides in with a nervous grin. You think to yourself, if my footsteps could talk, they'd definitely be saying, are we sure about this? You crouch near one of the cracks, tracing the delicate fissures with a gloved finger. They look like frozen lightning, branching in unpredictable angles. Some cracks are surface deep, others, hidden under a dusting of snow, run all the way down to the black ocean beneath. You imagine stepping on the wrong one, the sudden drop, the shock of water colder than pain itself, the desperate scramble back to the surface. Explorers fell through sometimes. Most of them didn't make it, but some did, dragging themselves out, clothes freezing around them like plates of armor. A quirky tidbit chills your thoughts. Some crews carried long poles specifically so they could poke the ice ahead of them, like cautious detectives investigating a stubbornly silent floorboard. You picture yourself doing the same, tap, 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 hoping the ice doesn't decide to relocate while you're standing on it. You rise and take a few more steps across the shifting floes. The wind pushes faintly, and you feel the entire surface sway. It's subtle, but unmistakable, like floating on a mattress that someone else is adjusting. You steady yourself. Explorers often describe this sensation as deeply unsettling, to stand on solid ground that is undeniably moving. Historians still argue whether this constant instability was more psychologically exhausting or physically dangerous. Probably both. You can feel why. You continue along the narrow channel until it widens into a broad field of pressure ridges, jagged walls of ice shoved upward by the grinding force of the frozen sea. Some ridges rise as high as houses, others form labyrinths. You approach one now, a crystalline formation glowing faintly blue from within. The ice cracks beneath its own weight, sharp echoes ringing through the frozen air. You reach out, placing your hand against the wall. It's smoother than you expect, cold enough to sting through your glove. You imagine an explorer climbing one of these ridges, ice axe in hand, searching for a vantage point to plan the next route. One wrong foothold, one patch of brittle ice, and the entire face could collapse. Yet they had no choice. Turning back often meant death, and pushing forward meant gambling with physics. Your second joke sneaks in like a whispered confession. Climbing an ice wall in the Arctic is basically nature's way of saying, bet you wish you'd stayed home with a blanket and hot chocolate. You weave your way between the ridges, the path narrowing, then widening unpredictably. The ice crunches beneath your boots, hollow in places, solid in others. Every sound feels amplified, every pop, every groan, every distant crack, like a drumbeat. You pause when a deep rumble rolls beneath you. Somewhere far off, a floe just shifted, pushing another block upward in a slow-motion crash. You feel the vibration through your feet, up your legs, into your chest. It's humbling, even terrifying, but also strangely calming, like the Arctic, reminding you that it's alive, ancient, and not particularly concerned about your itinerary. You move carefully, stepping from block to block. Your breath fogs in front of you in slow waves, and then you stop, foot poised over a narrow seam of ice that looks wrong, too smooth, too thin, too eager to be stepped on. You pull your foot back. Explorers often made these split-second judgments, choices that determine the fate of the entire journey. Go left? Go right? Step here? Step around? Each decision a turning point on this fragile, shifting world. You circle the seam and continue, heart beating just a touch faster. A scholarly debate floats through your thoughts. Some researchers believe that certain expeditions failed because leaders refused to adapt to the constantly changing ice conditions. Others think survival was simply about luck, being in the right place at the right moment when the flows shifted favorably. You squint at the fractured horizon, thinking both theories seem equally plausible. The Arctic doesn't negotiate. It moves as it wishes. The path finally leads you to a broad, unstable expanse, floe after floe bobbing gently like enormous frozen lily pads. You step onto the first one, feeling the subtle rise beneath your boots. Then the next. Then the next. The dark water gleams between them, smooth and terrible. Your final joke for the section floats up with a shiver. If this were a video game, you'd definitely be in the don't fall into the icy water, or you have to start over level. You keep going, breath held, movement slow and intentional. The ice shifts. Your balance holds, and eventually the floes flatten into a more solid sheet. You step onto it with relief, though you know better than to trust it completely. The Arctic saved its cruelest surprises for those who relaxed too soon. You breathe slowly, calmly, grateful for firm ground beneath your boots, even if it might change its mind at any second. And as you walk onward into the dim Arctic light, you feel those turning points lingering behind you, silent, invisible, and endlessly waiting for the next set of footsteps. You walk away from the broken world of shifting floes, feeling a subtle steadiness return to the snow beneath your boots. The terrain evens out into long, pale stretches, quiet plains where the wind sighs low instead of snarling. Something in the air has changed. You can't name it at first, but you sense it. A thin thread of anticipation woven through the cold. The kind that makes your chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with a small, flickering hope. You're almost afraid to feel, and that's when you see it. Far off, so far the shape looks like a trick of light, a dark silhouette against the horizon. Not ice, not a ridge, not a storm. Something built, something human. You blink once, twice. Your breath hitches just slightly. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the explorers around you whispering, straining to believe their eyes. A ship, or the vague outline of one. Could it be? After months, sometimes years, of starvation, frostbite, mental strain, and choices no one should ever have to make, rescue often appeared just like this, faint, blurry, and almost too fragile to trust. A mainstream historical fact floats into your mind. Many Arctic rescues happened not by grand design, but by chance. Whaling ships stumbling upon starving men, supply vessels arriving late but just in time, or even rival nations' crews choosing compassion over competition. Survival wasn't always the result of a noble plan. Sometimes it was simply timing. You begin walking faster, your boots thumping against the snow in deliberate, hopeful steps. Your heartbeat syncs with the rhythm, but you restrain yourself. You know how many false alarms explorers faced. Phantom ships, misidentified shadows, dreamlike shapes conjured by exhaustion. The Arctic loved illusions. Your first joke of this section slips in as you squint into the pale distance. If you've ever waved back at someone who turned out to be a lamppost, congratulations. You understand 19th century Arctic navigation. Still, the shape grows clearer as you approach. The edges sharpen. Details emerge. Mast lines, maybe, or the outline of a structure built from driftwood and canvas. Not grand, not pristine, but undeniably real. You inhale sharply, letting the cold bite at your lungs in a way that feels almost invigorating. Reaching the crest of a small ridge, you look down and finally see what it is. A relief camp. A small one, more like a supply outpost than a full rescue ship. But enough. Enough to mean safety. Enough to mean warmth. Enough to mean that not all stories end with the ice closing over the last footstep. You stand there for a long moment, letting yourself imagine the explorers' reactions. Some would fall to their knees, some would laugh, some would cry, silently or openly, depending on personality and how many frozen tears their eyelids could tolerate. Some might collapse completely, faces pale and hollow, but lit from within by the first spark of real hope they'd felt in ages. Food waits there, blankets, shelter, heat, human voices, and perhaps most importantly, the end of a nightmare. You descend the ridge slowly, savoring the relief that almost feels like warmth. The outpost sits nestled beside a line of rocks, smoke curling from a small stovepipe. A flag flaps in slow motion, stiff with frost. You approach the makeshift door and hear muffled voices inside, soft, steady, familiar in a way you haven't heard in your journey so far. It sounds like conversation not born of desperation, but of normalcy. You pause just outside, letting your gloved hand rest on the weathered wood. And then you imagine stepping inside. The heat hits first, a wave so sudden your eyes sting. Someone turns their head, eyes widening, face shocked but kind. Another person stands quickly. A third reaches out with a cup of something steaming, and suddenly everybody is talking at once. Questions, instructions, reassurances. You can almost hear the chaotic compassion. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some rescued explorers later wrote that the shock of warm food was so intense it made them dizzy, even nauseous. A few said the smell of stew nearly brought them to tears. One man reportedly savored a biscuit for a full hour, nibbling tiny bites like it was a priceless artifact. You imagine yourself sitting by the stove, boots off, toes tingling painfully as they thaw. Someone wraps a blanket around your shoulders. Someone else sets a bowl in your hands. You feel heat return in awkward pulses, prickling your skin, a slow, steady revival. Historians still argue whether these rescue missions were adequately planned or mostly reactive. Some believe governments should have acted sooner. Others note the logistical nightmares of navigating unpredictable Arctic waters. The debates linger like frost, unresolved but persistent, because rescue stories are never just stories. They're questions, they're judgments, they're narratives still being shaped long after the ice swallowed the original footprints. You shift slightly on the bench, feeling the warmth seep into your legs. The explorers inside tell stories, halting, exhausted accounts of what happened. Some details are clear, others are muddled, shaped by trauma and cold. Rumors swirl, tales spread. Some become heroic, others controversial. Accounts diverge, perspectives clash. Your second joke of the section arrives with a soft chuckle. Imagine trying to give a detailed report after months of starvation. How many days were you lost? Several? Many? Time is fake. You can almost see the rescuers scribbling notes, trying to piece together what actually happened. Later, newspapers will embellish. Admiralties will defend decisions. Critics will accuse. Survivors will disagree with each other. And the Arctic, silent and impartial, will keep its own version of events buried in snow. You step back outside the outpost now, watching smoke curl into the sky. Rescue isn't just salvation, it's transition, a before and after. Some explorers would go home and become legends. Some would fade quietly into obscurity. Some would face scrutiny. Some would write books. Others would never speak of it again. You imagine walking away from the outpost, restored enough to think clearly, but forever changed. The snow feels softer now, less threatening. The horizon looks wider. The sky feels almost friendly. Your third quiet joke slips gently into the cold air. If your welcome back party includes a doctor, a priest, and someone insisting you try soup immediately, you know your trip went poorly. You take one more slow breath, letting the smell of wood smoke cling to your imagination. The Arctic stretches out behind you, the hardships, the hunger, the storms, the choices. Ahead lies the journey home, where these stories will grow, shift, collide, and settle into the strange mix of truth and myth that always follows great ordeals. You turn your face toward the gentler light on the horizon and walk forward, knowing the final chapter waits just ahead, etched into snow, memory, and the lingering taste of boiled leather. You leave the rescue outpost behind, not because you want to, but because the story pulls you onward, asking you to look back at everything that happened across this frozen world and understand it differently. The air is calmer now, almost gentle, carrying a whisper of warmth that feels symbolic, more than physical. Your boots move across a stretch of snow that no longer feels like an adversary, just a surface, a memory, a page turning, and as you walk, the strange final chapter of this journey begins to take shape. The legacy of those explorers, and how something as bizarre as eating boot leather became not just a fact of survival, but a peculiar badge of honor whispered through history. You find yourself approaching a rocky rise, one of the rare places where the Arctic shows its bones instead of burying everything in white. The stones are dark, rounded, crusted with frost. You sit on one, adjusting your coat as if settling into a familiar chair, and let your gaze drift across the open snowfields. Behind them lie all the hardships you've crossed: hunger, hallucinations, shifting ice, blinding darkness, and stories told by moonlight. Ahead lies reflection. A mainstream historical fact rises first. Explorers who returned from these expeditions, gaunt, scarred, but alive, often became symbols of national pride. Their journals were published, their maps displayed, their portraits commissioned, their lectures filled halls. Even when expeditions failed, survivors were sometimes hailed as heroes simply for enduring the unimaginable. And nothing exemplified that endurance more than their willingness to eat whatever the Arctic allowed, including their own boots. You let that sink in for a moment. Imagine being introduced at a gala as the man who survived by boiling his footwear. Fame comes in many flavors, apparently. Your first quiet joke lands with a gentle shake of your head. These men didn't just walk a mile in their boots. They had dinner with them afterward. The wind lifts a curl of snow past your feet. You picture those explorers back home trying to adjust to normal life. Some never fully did. They'd sit at dinner tables too laden with food, look at steaming roasts and baskets of bread, and feel something inside them tighten. Part gratitude, part disbelief, part ghost of hunger that never quite left. They'd wrap their fingers around warm cups of tea and remember nights where the only warmth came from a thin fire struggling against the cold. You imagine one of them giving a lecture at a crowded hall. His audience leans in as he describes frostbite, storms, and the silent dread of an Arctic night. Someone inevitably asks the question everyone is thinking: what was it like to eat your own boot? And the explorer laughs, not bitterly, but with that soft, strange humor of someone who has lived through something surreal. He explains the process, maybe embellishes for effect, maybe downplays his fear, and the hall laughs with him. Because it's easier to laugh than to imagine the desperation behind that act. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind. Some explorers kept fragments of their old leather gear as mementos, tiny pieces of straps, buckles, or sole scraps, tucked away in drawers like relics, not morbid, not sentimental, just reminders. Proof that yes, it really happened. You shift on the rock, feeling the cold seep through your coat, not the sharp, biting cold of earlier, just a mild reminder that you're still in the Arctic, even as your story edges toward its close. Historians still argue about how these tales should be told. Were these men heroes, Fools? Victims of flawed planning, or exemplars of human endurance? Was boot eating a humiliating necessity, or an act of gritty survival deserving of respect? The debates swirl like drifting snow, never quite settling. You lean forward slightly, watching your breath curl into the air. The legacy feels bigger than the facts. It's not just that explorers ate their boots, it's that they chose to live in every way they could. They adapted. They endured hardship without surrendering their curiosity, teamwork, or sense of humor. They kept going even when the world around them gave them every reason not to. Your second joke appears in a soft murmur. If stubbornness were a sport, Arctic explorers would have taken home all the medals, including some they forged out of ice and wishful thinking. You rise from the rock and take a few steps into the open again. The snow ahead is smooth, untouched, glowing faintly under a shy sky. It feels like stepping into the ending of a story, not abrupt, not triumphant, but peaceful. You walk slowly, letting each step imprint a quiet rhythm. You think about the explorers' impact today, how their journals shaped scientific understanding, how their maps, often wrong but brave, pushed future expeditions forward, how their survival techniques are still studied, how their stories, bizarre as they are, continue to fascinate. And yes, how the legend of eating boots remains one of the strangest, most oddly inspiring chapters in human adventure. Your third and final joke of the section arrives like a soft chuckle. Thousands of years from now, archaeologists might find old diary entries and think boot eating was a normal Arctic cuisine. Ah yes, they'll say, the ancient delicacy. You smile quietly, letting the humor settle before fading into reflection again. The Arctic stretches endlessly around you, but unlike earlier in your journey, it no longer feels hostile. It feels respectful, silent not with threat but with memory, as though acknowledging the resilience of everyone who walked these paths, whether they made it home or not. You stop, breathe, and let the last echoes of those stories fade gently, like footprints softening under drifting snow. And now, as the cold air stills, the landscape softens around you. The sharp edges of ice melt into gentle curves. The wind quiets into a faint whisper, barely brushing your coat. You feel the ground beneath your feet settle, no longer shifting or creaking, just resting, calm and still, like a world taking a long, steady breath. The dim horizon stretches into a pale wash of silver blue, the kind of light that doesn't demand anything from you. It simply exists, soft and comforting. Your own breath drifts upward in slow clouds, dissolving easily into the quiet. There is no urgency now, no hunger tugging at your thoughts, no frostbite biting at your fingertips. Just calm, just stillness. Let your shoulders loosen a little. Let the cold become background instead of pressure. You've walked through hardship, and now the Arctic opens before you like a quiet lullaby, stripped of its storms, leaving only the peaceful hum of snow settling in gentle layers. Far off, the memories of explorers fade into the soft dark, less like ghosts and more like distant echoes. Their stories feel lighter now, their struggles softened by distance, their courage lingering like the last flare of starlight before dawn. You take one final breath of cold, clean air and let it drift from you slowly, slowly, as the snow around you glows faintly like a lantern dimming. The wind quiets. The horizon blurs. The Arctic night folds softly around you, no longer threatening, just serene, steady, and endlessly still. Let it hold you. Let the last shiver ease out of your body. Let everything slow to a whisper. You're warm. You're safe. You're resting.